All right. So make a new folder for this. Well, actually, so since there's no starter code for this one, instead of just making an empty folder, I'm going to just use creat-react-app to make the project folder itself. So just write in my exercises folder, I'm gonna npx creat-react-app, call it palindrome, and that looks good. Now we get to watch bars fill for a minute. So just a review for anyone who doesn't remember, the npx command, it's similar to the npm command, but it will install and run a library depending on if you already have it. So if you haven't installed a library before, npx will install it first and then run it on your machine. But if you've already installed it, because like I've been using creat-react-app for other projects, then npx will use the version that you've already installed and just run that. So it's a convenient way to run a command if you're not actually sure if it exists on your machine already, or if you just want to install it and run it in one command instead of two. You see it a lot in tutorials, I guess. Can be handy. See, I'm sorry, this does take kind of a little while. I don't know if anyone's ever seen like jokes or memes on the internet about how node modules is like such an enormous folder. It's like the densest material in the universe is the node modules folder in React app. This is really what it's talking about with React, and especially creat-react-app. You're just installing like tons of libraries before you even started writing code.
Yeah, is there any way to like start the app with like something lighter, or is it all is this the only way to do it?
No, there are other ways. So first, imagine there was a time before creat-react-app when you would have to install these dependencies yourself and then configure them manually yourself. Webpack and Babel. So that's certainly much worse than what we're doing now. But also there are other compilers that you can use to start projects other than creat-react-app. So we're using CRA, creat-react-app, because it's kind of like the official recommended starter kit from React. But there are other options. So here's another project that I've been kind of looking at in my own personal time that I've been curious about. It's not going to be part of the curriculum because this does basically the same thing as creat-react-app, except that we're using creat-react-app. But the main selling point of Vite, this library, is that it's just very fast. Vite is just French for quick. So if you feel like you like creat-react-app, but it's just too slow for you, this is something that you might consider. It works basically the same way, except you type Vite instead of creat-react-app. It was originally for Vue. They also have React templates. So React, React-TX, a whole bunch of different templates. So basically what I'm saying is that I hear you. Creat-react-app can feel kind of slow. If you really don't like that, there are some options you have for like a faster way to build your app. But this is kind of the standard recommendation, and I think it'll be good enough for us for right now.
And do you think like if we use Vite or if we use some other like something different, do you think that will get in the way of learning the material?
I don't think so. No, I don't think that would really have any big impact on your experience here. Yeah, really just the initial command for scaffolding the application will be different. But other than that, you run all the same commands, you write all the same code. All right, so I've created a this blank project using creat-react-app. So it's a pretty simple exercise. I don't think I'm going to need to define any like new components or anything. I can just do everything right in the app component. So the first requirement is that there needs to be an input. Oh, that's the README for creat-react-app, never mind. So the first requirement is that there needs to be an input so the user can type in a word so we can check if it's a palindrome. But now we need to know when this changes, when they're typing something, we can react to it with an event. An onChange event. Now we got to define that function. All right, so now I've got just an empty function that'll handle this change event. Now, what I think I want to do here is set some state. I want to keep track of what the user has typed into the input. So I'm going to have to create some state for that. So we're going to use the useState hook. Got to import it first. And then inside the app, I'm going to create a state to keep track of what they're typing. Just typing one word. And we're going to initialize that to just an empty string by default. For a string data type, that seems like a pretty sensible kind of default value, just an empty string. So now that I've got my set word function defined from useState, I can use that in my handle change function here to keep track of what the user typed in. Set word. So remember, on the event object, we get this property target, which tells us the HTML element that received the event. So in this case, event.target is going to refer to the input element. And then value is just going to get us whatever is typed in there. So we're going to get the value of the input and then call set word with that as our input. So that should update our state. Let me just confirm that that's working. Console.log the word every time it changes. So now we got to run this application so I can test it. Opening up my terminal. Now remember all the different ways that you can interact with your project. Those are listed in the scripts section of your package.json. So I think Ankur was telling you the other day how this package.json file is really similar to the requirements.txt file in a Django project. And that's true. The dependencies here, this is like the requirements.txt for your Django project. However, this package.json is also like the manage.py file for your Django project. So this scripts section is going to show different ways that you can interact with the project. And for different React or Node projects, you might see different scripts. Developers might define custom scripts here depending on how their team needs to interact with the code. But for right now, we just need to use the start script. So I'm going to npm start. That should start up the dev server, opens up my browser, goes to the correct URL. Should be. Okay, looks like we got a bug already, so we can do some debugging. Handle change is not defined. What's the problem?
You spelled on line 26 handle as hangle,
Oh my gosh.
or 29, sorry.
Yes, we cannot handle change. Thank you for pointing that out to me. Okay, cool. So now I've got basically just the React boilerplate, but there's also my input that I added. Andrew, question?
Difference between npm start and npm run start?
Yeah. So good question. So generally speaking, the way you invoke any of these scripts is with npm run and then the script name. The exception is that for start, this is like kind of special. And so just as a convenience or a shortcut, you can invoke the start script using npm run start or just npm start. I don't know why they have that little shortcut in there. It's just like it saves you 4 characters of typing. And I just kind of don't like remembering that there's another way to run these commands. So I usually type run, even though it's unnecessary. But for sure, just to run the start script, like I could just do that and save myself a little bit of typing. It's exactly the same. But for these other ones, you'll have to type like npm run test or npm run build in order to get those other commands to run. Yeah, good that you're paying attention there. It was a subtle difference that I snuck in from today's lecture between yesterday's. I'm not sure if I've seen this error before. This might be the first time I've run creat-react-app since this update. So I'm gonna have to figure out what React is yelling at me about, how to use create-root instead. That might be a fun breakout topic soon. Yeah, so now I can type into this input. So it looks like we're able to capture the input and it's saved in our state value. We're logging into the console. And then just like you saw previously, though, the logs are lagging kind of one action behind what I'm typing in. So, I type in world, the last log that we see is WORL. And just to review, that's because set state is asynchronous. So I set the new word here, but this doesn't actually take effect until after this function finishes executing. So when I console log it, I'm still seeing the previous value. So we're just kind of one delayed, but it does look like this is working correctly. So now, John, question?
Yeah, is event.target the same thing as event.current-target?
Often, but not always. I don't remember exactly, but there are ways that like the same event can get triggered on multiple elements. Sometimes, like I think this is related to like if you have a div inside of a div and they both have click event handlers. Like an event can have an original target and a current target because the same function might get run on multiple events, multiple elements. Let's see what we can learn in 20 seconds.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like for best practice, like if you were just doing like an on change like this, is it better to use target or current target? 'Cause I don't know. I've only been using current target. I didn't know.
I'm going to be honest, I've only used target in my code and I've never run into trouble with that. But it's certainly possible that you might find a more complicated event handling situation where this becomes relevant. Yeah, so it was about event bubbling. I was right on that. So yeah, it's like if you have a div inside of a div inside of a div, and they all have click handlers. If you click on the inner one, that'll fire a click event on that inner div, the container, and then the one outside of it, because that one click was a click on 3 different elements at once. So
Okay,
that
thank you
first
very
inner
much.
div would be the target for those 3 function invocations. But then the current target would change for the different elements that the event bubbled up to. So yeah, I guess it's just not an everyday kind of situation that I'm concerned about event bubbling. This is something that I think you need to be prepared to handle, but a simple UI isn't going to have click events inside of click events all the time. All right. Were there any other questions just now? No? All right. So I've got my word now in our state. So now I need a way to determine if the word is a palindrome. So first of all, technically an empty string is a palindrome because it's the same forwards and backwards. I don't really like that definition, so I'm not going to count it. So the first thing I'm doing here is checking word and, because I want to make sure that word is defined. If we get undefined, null, or an empty string, I don't want to count that as a palindrome, even though technically it's the same backwards as it is forwards. So I'm going to use this short circuiting to check that the word exists first. It is defined with the truthy value. And if it does exist, we're going to do some quick array manipulation here. We're going to split the word into an array. So it's just a list of the individual characters. We're going to reverse the array because you cannot reverse a string in JavaScript, but you can reverse arrays. So I had to convert this to an array really quick. We're going to convert that array back into a string then after we've reversed it. So we're going to use join. And then at the end of all that, we want to check if this is the same as the original word. So this is basically the definition of a palindrome. If the word is the same backwards as it is forwards, then we've got a palindrome. Suppose I can make this a little better by turning the word to lowercase so that like a word that starts with a capital letter can be still considered a palindrome if you like reverse it and still start with capital, but whatever. This is good enough for now. So let's see if this works. Set a console.log word. So again, we're 1 character delayed here, but if I type wow, this is going to tell us on the previous action, wow was a palindrome. It's the same forwards as backwards, that returns true. So now the very last step is I need to use this information about whether or not our word in the state is a palindrome and render some information on the screen that tells the user, if they typed in a palindrome. So we're going to have to do a little bit of JavaScript here. So I'm opening up some curly braces. Now I'm going to use a ternary statement here. A ternary, well, it's not a statement, a ternary expression, ternary operator. We're checking is palindrome. This is going to be either true or false. And if it's true, if it's not, I will instead put this other paragraph. There are a few different ways I could have done this. I think the suggestion in the README for this exercise was to use string interpolation using the the backtick strings with the dollar hash syntax in JavaScript. I preferred to do it this way for no particular reason. So this is kind of a clean example, I think, of using a ternary to display output, since there's two things that I might want to display. So let's look at that. Okay, so I type in wow, tells me this is a palindrome. Add an exclamation mark. It's no longer a palindrome. Race is not a palindrome. Race car is a palindrome. So it looks like I've solved this problem. I mean, it was a pretty simple requirements. So I think I've satisfied them concisely here. Don't need to go above and beyond. Andrew, question?
Don't you have to hand in the prop to the argument? Because it's still like one behind right now, right?
So it's only one behind during the invocation of handle change.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah, so by the time we get down to here, this is looking at the up-to-date version of the state. Good question, though. Any other questions about the solution I've used here, the approach I've taken? No questions. Yeah, this was a pretty simple one. I'm hoping nobody struggled on this too much, just based on, all the practice we've gotten over the past few days. All right, so if nobody has any more questions about this, I'm going to move on and demo a solution to the whack-a-mole game. All right, so this is the starter code here for the whack-a-mole game. So let's run this first, see what it does before I've written any code. All right, not a whole lot. We've just got 9 moles in our little grid here. All right, so a couple things. For many of the exercises going forward, I'm trying to build a solution branch on GitHub so that you can view the solution. So I'm probably going to be using that in just a second. I'm just going to check out another branch so you can see the completed version of this project. and I'll just talk about it instead of walking through building it. It's only really a few lines of code. But the reason why I'm mentioning that now is because for these kinds of exercises that already have a lot of starter code, just looking at a solution, it's kind of hard to see like what needed to be done, what was added in addition to the starter code and what did we actually start with. So one thing that can be useful is using git diff to compare two different branches. So the master branch here is what you see on GitHub by default. It has just the starter code. Solution is my branch that I just created now that has a working solution. Git diff solution. Let's try that again. Git diff solution src, because I don't want to see differences in like node modules or package JSON or whatever. Okay. So these are the only changes that I had to make between the starter code and then my finished version. So let's see, let's go to the app first. So currently we are rendering 9 moles, for each of our 9 dens, rendering a mole for each one. But right now, the only information that the mole has is the key. And that's not even really part of our application logic. That's just React needs that in order to render a list so it can keep track of which items are actually separate and distinct from each other. But so I know that these moles shouldn't always be visible. So I'm going to define a property. Going to define a property that can tell the mole if it should be visible or not. Because remember, the dens already have this property, is mole visible. It's just randomly set to either true or false when we create the application, or when we run get den state every time. They're randomly either visible or not. So we're going to pass that data in through the dens here. And then similarly, people need to be able to whack the moles. That's the name of the game here. So I'm going to make an event handler that lets us handle that. Whacked. And yeah, that function is also already defined for us from the starter code. Just increments the points. We just had to plug it in here. So that happens when you click on the moles. All right, so now the app is passing information into the moles that they need, but we haven't done anything to the moles themselves. So they're not using any of those props that they're getting passed in. And the way that we addressed that sorry. So we have to use the is mole visible property and then conditionally render this image based on that. So just add a simple condition first. We're going to check that is mole visible is true. And then if that is true, then we will render the icon. So that was all I did from the starter code. So let's just run it, see what happens. Is my previous project still running? Yeah. Oh, no, I was just already running a server for this project. Okay. So now I've got some moles. Every 1.5 seconds, they're appearing in random locations. Something's actually not working though. And it seems my points are not incrementing for some reason. Hang on a second. All right. So one more thing I forgot to do at the app, we're passing this click handler through the mole, but the mole itself is not using it. So we're going to have to add that in really quick. All right, so let's try this one more time. So we're still getting our moles in random spots, but now I can click on a mole and it increments the points. So I guess one kind of downside of my solution is that when I click on the moles, they don't disappear. Ideally, the first time you hit a mole, it goes away immediately. So I can't just like click the same mole like 2 or 3 times. Maybe that should be like a stretch goal. Next version of this app. Jesse, you have a question?
Yeah, on your console, you have a React hook missing dependency. I was just wondering what that's talking about, because I saw that error yesterday as well, or a warning.
I think it's that array in your start game and the use effect. See that empty array?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I agree with that warning. We'll talk more about this on Friday as we'll explore use effect in much more depth.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, no, React seems to think that I'm missing something, but I think my app is fine the way it is. Might have to look into this a little bit afterwards. Any other questions about my whack-a-mole game?
Raphael, I have a question about the double and operator. Could you go
Yep.
back to the mode.js code? So within like your JSX code with the double like brackets all around it. So the first thing it checks is like, is it a truthy value, right? Prop is mo visible. And then it goes to the right and then it conducts it, or is it checking if the right is a truthy value too?
Honestly, it doesn't check if the right is truthy. If the left
Okay.
value is truthy, then this whole expression evaluates to what's on the right side.
Okay. Is that different than like normal JavaScript? Because I thought normally it would just check if both are true, right?
like, if you're talking about like a logical expression, you know, if something, whatever, then yeah, you expect both of them to be true. You expect both of these to be true in order for the body to be executed. But in this case, this is for assignment. We're saying like foo equals foo equals 10 and 12. So in this case, because 10 is defined, it is a truthy value, foo will receive the value 12. If we say bar equals false and hello, bar is false, because you know we don't. The first one has to be truthy in order to go with the second one. If they're both falsy, so we say so these are both falsy values. Or wait, I'm sorry. If the first one is truthy and the second one is falsy, that's what I meant to show you. Hello and empty string, so Baz is going to be empty string, even though this is a falsy value, because the first one is truthy, that means the result of this expression is just whatever's on the right.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that helps a lot. I thought it was like some magic happening, but just that little example there like cleared it up for me.
Great, I'm glad. I think this is one of the things that kind of makes React hard to learn in general, is that it does have a lot of magic going on in it, but there's also a lot of plain old JavaScript that you just kind of see in sort of a new way. And it's easy to think that it's magical if you don't look at it too hard. So I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad I could clear that up for you. There was another hand that went up. I forgot whose it was.
It's me, Jake.
Hello.
So when you start the game, before you even click anything, it's already like on some sort of loop. It initializes the moles that are like out of the hole versus the ones that are in the den. And then after so much time, it continues to go and it like reinitializes those and all that. Can you just walk through maybe a couple iterations of that so I can see like how they're initially getting set and then how it changes and they get reset again? Like just follow the flow of that process.
So use effect is something we're going to learn about more on Friday, but long story short, this code here is saying that, you know, we're defining a function here, and this function should run when this component loads the first time. There are different ways you can use effect, but in this case, we're saying that start game should run when this component loads initially. So component loads, we're going to call start game. So start game is going to set an interval in which we set dens. So we're all familiar with set interval, right? It just calls some other function repeatedly. So this is saying every 1.5 seconds, we're going to set dens using get den state. So set dens is just our setter from use state. So that's just where we use to change the dens. So the only interesting part left here is what is get den state? What is it that we're setting our dens to every 1.5 seconds? So we've got small function here, some pretty dense functional programming. It creates an array with 9 empty cells, 9 empty elements. And then we fill them up with objects. I don't think that's strictly necessary. honestly. But that's what we're doing here in the starter code. But so we've got an array of 9 objects, and then we're going to map over them so we can transform them into 9 different related objects. It's going to be an object with one property, is mole visible. And we want that to be randomly either true or false. So this is kind of a tricky and dense way of choosing either true or false. We're creating an array here. So this is just a hard-coded literal array with 2 elements, true and false. And then we're indexing into that array, either 0 or 1 to get the first element or the second element. But we're not hard-coding 0 or 1. We're getting a random number. So we're using math.random, which is going to get us a float value between 0 and 1. So like these kind of numbers. So if we round that, that should give us either 0 or 1, depending on if the number is greater than or less than 0.5. So yeah, this expression here is either 0 or 1, which indexes into this array and gets us either true or false. So then we have 9 of these objects with the property is mole visible as either true or false. Sound good?
Yeah, that was helpful. So I was under the impression that as soon as the app function runs, then the state variables that's the first thing that happens is it reads those first 2 lines. But the way you described it, it sounds like it starts the game first. It sees that use effect and it suddenly does that. And it doesn't actually set dens until you get into, where was it in start game down there? Or I think it was in get dens state is when it first uses the set dens function. So is that the first time that it actually sets the state, or is it upon running the app that those first 2 lines, 7 and 8, are run?
So I'd say that these 2 lines are run first. Like these get run when you define the component. But like a lot of this other code gets run every time the component re-renders.
Okay.
So let's see if I just put a just to give you some kind of an idea of when all this code runs. So you can see that, not really sure if this actually proves my point, just because React is a little bit hard to follow the flow. But you can see that the use effect runs once, just when I load the page. But this log at the top of the app component, this runs every time the component re-renders, which happens every 1.5 seconds from our use effect or from our set interval. But it also happens every time I click any of these moles. That also forces the app to re-render. So yeah, this function does run repeatedly, but I don't want you to think of it as if this happens multiple times. Like React knows if you've already initialized the state, or if you're just like referring to the same state that's already been initialized. I know that can be kind of hard to reason about just because I just showed you that this code runs multiple times, but you're supposed to imagine that this happens only once to initialize the state. But yeah, that's just how React works. Sorry, I hope that didn't make things more confusing, actually.
No, not at all. It helped actually. I feel like those are just, once they run, it's kind of on its own feedback loop. It's constantly getting feedback to determine if it needs to update its state. But for me, like I need to know if that's initialized or not upon running the app function, because when I'm trying to code the other functions, like I have a hard time understanding, like, excuse me, I have a hard time understanding, do I need to like set this variable in the function somehow, or is it already, was it already done? You know what I mean? So, and I've struggled with that, determining like when I'm creating a function in that, am I trying to use a variable that's even been set or not? Because it's hard for me to understand what the set state thing has been doing. But I think you just helped me understand that. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome. I mean, in theory, if you're initializing your state at the top of the component, it should have some value if you're checking it anywhere else in the component. Kat, did you have a question?
Yeah, I might be misunderstanding what you're saying, but I'm just I thought that the reason that the app kept updating, or you kept getting that one console log message, was because that function is called in start game and it's like set on an interval. Is that not accurate? Like that one function that it's calling, the den one, that one's set to like run at a consistent interval. I think like up top.
So
like I'm sorry, like, yeah, the start game function like is set to run at an interval. So isn't that why it keeps like console logging that one thing?
So the console log happens every time the component re-renders. And when we call set dens, so let's see, the component re-renders whenever any of the data, any of the state data that's required for its rendering changes. So, you know, we're using the den elements as part of this JSX template here, which we're storing that in the state. So anytime a value in our state changes, the component re-renders. So since set dens is changing our state, every time this gets called, that is what causes the app to re-render. But there are other things that cause the app to re-render as well. So here I just disabled that set timeout. So we're not calling set dens, you know, every 1.5 seconds. But still, when I click on one of these moles, we're incrementing the score, and that also changes the state. So that also forces the component to re-render. So you can see every time I'm clicking one of the moles, the state changes as we increment the points, and it's re-rendering the component. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, it would be re-rendering regardless of whether that set interval is there based on what's happening with the points.
Right. Anything that changes the state values will cause the component to re-render. So since set dens was changing state, this was causing the component to re-render. But there are other things that are changing the state also, which also cause it to re-render.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I saw one other question.
Raphael Spau.
Hello.
It's more of a request. I just find it really helpful, like hearing you walk through the process. Would it be possible just like continue from where you left off and just finish the entire loop, like the flow of like how this app like works. Like it's like one cycle.
You mean just like when I run the app, how it starts up, or
Just the code, like
everything?
kind of talk through the code, like the connections between and the entire flow.
Okay. So I guess since it's a React app, we'll start at the index.js, because this is the only script file that's actually in our HTML. So all this does is invoke React and say render the entire app. And so to understand what the app is, we have to look at that definition. So most of our actual React application is going to be defined in our app.js.
Sorry, I guess I was trying to say, because you were, you stopped at, I think it was the start, the get then state. Like, do you mind just like start from there and just complete the rest of the cycle?
Sorry, so get then state. Yeah. So anyway, this function, when you call it once, will just generate 9 random dens, generates 9 dens that are either have a mole in them or they don't. So it's just 9 objects that like this, visible or not, true or false. We're calling that function every 1.5 seconds in our set interval. And then whatever result we get from get den state, we're just passing that into set dens. So that becomes our new state. Because remember, we initialized our dens up top. This is one of our 2 state variables. And so we're just repeating that logic of just getting a new random set of dens every 1.5 seconds. The same way we initialized it, we're basically just reinitializing it every 1.5 seconds. But more than just changing the visual appearance of the moles, the visibility status affects whether or not they're clickable. Because here, see, for our den elements, this is here just creating the mole element, the mole component for each of our dens in our den array. So they're all identical, except for the fact that they need to have a different key, just so React can render things in a loop. And they have a different property for is visible. So this is how we can track in JavaScript, if a particular mole should be seen or not. So the rest of the logic here is going to be in the mole component itself. That's going to determine what the mole actually does with this information that's getting passed into it. The is visible, on mole whacked, the key. So we'll go to the mole itself. And so it's mostly just the den itself, just this div that has like kind of a frame for the mole, and then the actual mole itself. And we want to make sure that when the user clicks on the mole, we call that event handler that was passed in. So props.onMoleWhacked, it's just this onMoleWhacked property that was passed in from the app component. We define that right up here. This is a pretty common flow organization in React, is that some child component knows that it's clickable, but it doesn't know what's supposed to happen when you click on it. So the parent component knows what happens when the child gets clicked on. That's why the function is defined here. The child just knows that it is clickable and that its parent should tell it what happens when it gets clicked. So that's us passing that event handler in here. But we don't want this mole to be rendered all the time. It should only be visible when the property is visible is true. So we're going to do some conditional rendering here. We check if this is true or if it is truthy. and then using the double ampersand, if this is truthy, then we'll get this value over here will be put into the DOM as our HTML. And if this is falsy, then instead undefined gets added, which is nothing. That doesn't actually take up space. It's not visible. So this is a pretty good pattern if you want to conditionally render some element or nothing. This is a little bit different from using the ternary when I wanted to conditionally render some element or some other element. But yeah, pretty similar techniques. Does that help? Is there more that I can walk through here?
Yeah, that helped. Thank you.
Cool. Porphy?
Thank you. So how is this an assignment here? That's the only thing that I'm not getting. I understand, like, if it's an assignment, the double ampersand just checks if the first value is truthy and then runs the second value. But where are we saying that it's an assignment, not just like
Good question. So this is not assignment. So maybe I should kind of rephrase this example here. So what I'm talking about here is not in an if statement, but when we're just trying to evaluate a single value. So just like imagine if we're doing some mathematical operation, you can like have parentheses to say like evaluate this thing first. But maybe it's unclear like what exactly this value should be. This is a little bit different. But just so in this situation, we need what's in the parentheses to resolve to a single value. That's an expression in code, is just a whole bunch of values and operators that can be condensed down to a single value. So because this isn't an if statement, but it's just an expression, this is something that JavaScript is expecting a single value or some code that can be evaluated into a single value. This is the situation where this works because it's not an if statement. I know it's
so as long as it's outside of an if statement, that's how the double ampersand will work. It'll look at the two values and just check if one is truthy, and if it is, it'll use the other one. Otherwise, it'll return not true.
right. So let's see if we say like, okay, so I'm trying to add 15 plus whatever the result of this expression is. It's 10 and 5. So since 10 is a truthy value, it's going to use the value on the right. So this whole parenthetical expression just evaluates to 5, just the number 5. So we end up with bar equals 15 plus 5, and that gives us 20. So just because we're not in an if statement, I'm not expecting both of these to be true. I'm using this like short circuiting behavior is what it's called. So I hope that makes this a little more clear.
It does, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? On this exercise or any of the React concepts that we've covered so far? Come on, what questions do we have? Jake, let's hear it.
All right, I have one more. It should be a really basic question for you. In the where was it, app.js? Near the bottom, or yeah, right there. So den elements, it doesn't actually enter that function until it's called down on line 49, right? That's the first time we actually go into line 38 and perform that stuff?
No. So
No,
den
okay.
elements is not a function. This is just an array. We're not defining a function. There's work being done like in line right here. On
Oh, I
line
see.
38,
Okay.
we're mapping over the den's state value and creating a new array.
I see. The function stuff in there is the map stuff. Okay, the syntax, it got mixed up. It looks confusing to me. Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, I know what you mean. If you're just kind of like scrolling past real quick, it's easy to just be like, oh yeah, there's a function here, great. But on closer inspection, yeah, this is just the map callback. It's just telling map how to do its job. But this is synchronous code. It runs immediately on line 38 to compute a new array.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. All right, any other last minute questions? Alrighty, so it's almost 10:20. Let's take a break now, come back at 10:35, and I'm going to start building a news site in front of y'all's. And then your homework for tonight and for the next 6 days or so is going to be more or less kind of retreading what we covered in the lecture, building your own version of the news site. There are going to be, some minimum requirements, but I'm kind of hoping that you'll go above and beyond a little bit, kind of make it your own, personalize it a little bit, and all that kind of fun stuff. All right, so let me share my screen now. I'm going to start a new project so we can get started on the news site. All right, so I've created a folder now for React News Site 1. It's empty currently, except I've got this data folder. So eventually our application is going to use data from an API, but just starting out, we're not there quite yet. So we're going to use this dummy data to feed into our components just so we can test them out, make sure that they're rendering properly before we've actually hooked up all the API functionality. But news.json is just a list of news stories. Nav items is going to be a list of like news categories. We'll display that at the top of the page. But first, I'm going to need to create a new React app. Call this news site 1. Suppose just news site would have been a better name, because if I'm going to be building off of this in the subsequent days, eventually it's going to be news site 2, news site 3. So I might rename that folder at some point. Andrew, question?
Just a quick question on that renaming. Can you just right click rename folder and nothing's going to break on it?
I think so.
Yeah, I feel like it's just like it just puts the files in there, right? So you can rename it whatever you want.
Right. There are certainly other things that also get named automatically, like based on the folder name. Like I think if you look in the package.json, we'll be able to see like a project name or something. Will be news site 1. But if you just rename the folder after the fact, that shouldn't mess anything up, I don't think. But yeah, this is definitely a great time for asking questions as we're just watching bars fill here. And also, generally speaking, we've got about 90 minutes left for the lecture today, but the application I'm going to build is not legitimately going to take me 90 minutes to complete. So please ask many questions as I'm doing this. If just anything doesn't 100% make sense to you, or you want me to explain my thought process, happy to go into detail. All right. Got the happy hacking. So we're ready to go. I don't totally like this folder structure though. So I'm in my folder React News Site 1. Create-react-app just created this folder for me, News Site 1. So I don't like having this nested folder here. Normally I would use create-react-app to create the project folder itself, but like I already had this data folder that I wanted to put somewhere. So I'm just going to spend a moment here kind of juggling these folders around. So News Site 1, this subfolder here, this has all the actual like files from create-react-app. I'm just going to move these into the top level here. Moving everything from the news site folder to the current location. So that's everything that was in news site 1. Okay, so now the news site 1 folder is empty. I can delete that. And then one last thing is the data that I've got in my data directory. My components are going to need to access this data. So I'm going to move that into my source directory. Okay, cool. So this is all of the basic boilerplate from create-react-app plus my data directory. So that's all I was looking for. Rob, question?
Yeah, where did we pull the data folder from? Is that off the curriculum page?
It is not on the curriculum page, but on the exercise for tonight. I believe the starter code is actually just the data folder. So let me double check that real quick. So yeah, this is the exercise for tonight. We have a source folder. Oh, so we're actually doing you a lot of favors. We give you this components folder. Has, blank components in it. So you need to do some work here. But we at least give you the folder and file structure up front. And then critically, here's that data folder that I was talking about. So this is the news.json, a whole bunch of news stories, nav items. These are going to be the sections for our news app, the sections in our nav bar. So yeah, that's where the data is at. It's going to be included in the exercise itself when you get started tonight. All right, so I've copied my data directory over into the source. Let's look at this in VS Code now. Now that I've created these folders, that's going to be a more comfortable way to manipulate these files. All right, so at this point, you're probably familiar with a lot of this boilerplate from create-react-app. Now, I'm not really interested in like a lot of these files, to be honest. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is kind of delete the files that I know that I don't care about, that are not going to be used in this demo. So we might do some testing later, but I'm going to do it my own way, not using that. Not going to report web vitals, not using the React logo. And then don't need these logos here. All right. Probably don't need the favicon or the robots.txt, but I'm going to leave them for now. I don't think they're hurting anything. So we're just going to leave that there. So another thing I know I'm going to need is we're going to be defining multiple components. So I'm going to create a folder for my components inside of source. So the only component I'm not going to put in there is my app.js. That's kind of like an index file. So that's going to be on the folder outside. But then all of my individual components that'll appear inside of the app, I'm going to put in this components folder. So now for today, I'm not actually going to be really building much of a completed application, but this is going to be more kind of planning out the application. So we're going to build our building blocks, so to speak. So I'm mostly just going to be defining components that can be used later in a more sophisticated application. So I'm just going to make a few files here just to give you a preview of the components that we'll be defining throughout this lecture. So first of all, we need to have an app navigation. So this is going to be like our top menu bar. Let us go to different sections of the news site. We're going to need an article component. So, when you're actually viewing an article, this is going to show the text, the title, images, all the important information we need to see about that. But before you actually read an article, there's going to be an article teaser. So you can see, a preview of the article. So let's make a component for that. And I think that's good for now. We might create some more components, but this is a good start. I'm also going to delete all this nonsense here in the app.js. We just got a div, class name of app. This definitely needs to have the class app because this is rendering in something with ID of root. So I guess it's not absolutely essential that this has the class name app, but it's a good idea to have some kind of class on the containing parent element in case we need to refer to it. So I want to think about my data for a second before I even get into the components here. I'm going to want to display article data in these components, displaying different aspects of the article in the teaser, the trailer, or in the article itself. But first, I need to get this data into my state in my app. So starting out, we're going to keep this simple. The user is not going to be able to choose an article. We're just going to pick a random article and then display information from that article on our page. So I want to pick a random article from the news, but I'm going to have to import it in order to do that. So let's see, I'm in my app.js. The data folder is in the same folder, and then news.json is inside of that. So we import news. So we're going to get a random index here from 0 to the length of the news array. So that should get us a random news article. All right, so that should be choosing a random article for us. All right, so I've written enough code that I can actually run it and verify that I haven't made a mistake already. So let's run this, see what it does.
Was it that root thing that you took out because it's trying to append elements to the root, like a root div?
What are you asking about?
Remember, it was, just a minute ago, we were looking for that root, I think. Isn't it like the index.html? There's a root div that it's trying to append everything else to.
There is, but I don't think that's exactly what this warning is talking about.
Okay.
There's like different syntax that I'm supposed to use for React 18 versus React 17.
Huh.
Yeah, I know. I'll have to read up about this more later, but this is not a showstopper for right now. Yeah, React is perfectly willing to behave as if it's React 17, which in my opinion was perfectly fine. So I'm not too concerned about this right now, but it's definitely on my list of things to look up and figure out. We're getting complaint here about the manifest not existing. My index.html still refers to it. So let me take that out. Okay, so now it's not complaining about that anymore. So now we're able to generate a random article when the app loads. So it looks kind of like one of these. It's got an abstract, which generally is supposed to be just like a summary of the article. But for today, we're going to pretend like that's the full text of the article. Byline has important attribution information, got a created date, and other information you would expect an article to have. Title. Oh, and then the actual URL where you can read the article. Oh, except that this article is no longer available, but we're just going to pretend like these are still valid links. Andrew, did you have a question?
Yeah, pretty easy one. Why does it show two objects? Mine does the same thing right now.
Yep. So that's a really good question. The short answer is that I don't know, but generally speaking, this function is going to run every time this component needs to re-render. So the answer to your question is, why is React re-rendering? And sometimes there are subtle things that you might do in your application that causes React to re-render a component and when maybe you thought it wasn't necessary. So I don't know, maybe it renders once when the page loads, and then as I'm like setting the state, it loads again. That doesn't quite make sense to me. Honestly, I feel like I've done so little in this application so far. I don't know why the app component should need to render twice. But honestly, it's not like a huge problem. Like a single render doesn't take very long. So if you think your application should be rendering a component 6 times and it renders 7 times, it's probably not like a problem. It's if your component is constantly re-rendering like 100 times a second, then maybe you have problem that you should investigate. But something like this where it renders twice on page load instead of once, I'm a little bit less concerned about. It would be good if I could figure out why this is happening, but it won't really like harm the application's performance, I don't think. Good question though. It's definitely something that I'm curious about now. We'll probably try to figure out after this lecture.
Hey, Raphael, if I could maybe ask, can you go back to your index.js if you don't mind?
For sure. Index?
Yep. Okay, I guess never mind. Ignore my thought. I was thinking, I read online that if you're using strict mode, your component does render twice, but usually for console logs, it'll only put out one console log. But in this case, ignore what my thought process was. All right, never mind.
Huh. I mean, that sounds really unusual, but there's an easy way that I can test this quickly.
No, I was thinking if strict mode was not there, then it would not. Then it would only show one console log. But I guess you have strict mode, so I guess I'm not even quite sure.
Well, I don't know. Okay, but now I'm just really curious anyway, and I have to just see what happens.
Yeah, I'm looking online and it seems like it might work if you take out the strict mode, because strict mode causes it to render twice.
What is happening? Sorry, my editor was upset with me. Okay, so now it only renders once when I'm running outside of strict mode. I have no idea why that would be, but apparently that made a difference. If anything, I would expect strict mode would prevent redundant re-rendering, but I don't know, that's React for you. So good questions. Ankur, thanks for pointing that out. All right, so I'm getting this random article index now. And we can see that I'm actually generating an article. So now I can create some other components that might use this data. And then we can display it in an interesting way. So I think the next component that I want to build out is going to be the article teaser. I think this is just going to be a simpler, smaller component. So I'm going to do that next. All right, so in my components directory, I've got my article teaser. Currently, there's nothing here. So we're using functional-based components. So I'm making a function. Like all React components, it's going to accept props as an input argument. Before I forget, we need to export the component. I forget this step like all the time, so often I'll just do it first thing when I create a new file. Now, most importantly, we need to return some JSX. There may or may not be other logic, but we definitely need to return some markup. And have a div that contains our entire element because all of our components need to return one top level parent element. So commonly it's pretty handy to just have a div that encloses your entire component. So you can have any number of elements inside of it and you still have one parent element that is this div. So at some point, we're going to make these clickable links for the article teasers so that you can like click on a teaser and it takes you to the article itself. So we're going to put an anchor tag in here. But they have to know what article they're clicking on. So we'll put the title there. And generally people like to know that the news that they're reading is up to date. So we're going to put the created date here. Cool. So that looks like a pretty basic component. So let's see if we can render it in our app. So we've got an article teaser. But we're going to need to let the article teaser know which article it's supposed to render. And we have selected an article here, but it wouldn't really be great to just pass this random article directly into the article teaser, because this is just like a random local variable. React doesn't know about it. So if the article changed, the article teaser wouldn't know about that automatically, because this article is not part of our React state. So I'm going to create some state in React so we can keep track of which article is the current article, because in the future this is going to change. It's going to be dynamic. So we're using state, so we have to import that first of all. All right, and then after we choose a random article, we're going to set it in state. Now, we're not going to pass in all of the details from the articles, because honestly, they have a lot of information on them that we don't care about. Like, I don't even know what some of these are. Des facet, geofacet, I can maybe kind of infer. But like kicker, I have no idea what this is supposed to be. So I'm only going to pull in the data that I know about, that I want to use in my application. So first of all, every one of these articles is going to need to have an ID. So it's going to be the index of where it was in the array. Got a title. Abstract. Byline. Image. So this one's going to be a little bit trickier than some of the other fields, because, so let's take a look actually. So for one thing, if they do have images, it's going to be in this multimedia folder, which is going to be an array. They're going to have multiple images. We're just going to show the first one. But this gets tricky because some of these don't have any images at all. So far, all the ones we've looked at do have images, but I swear some of them don't. Okay, so here, this is what, like the 5th news story or something. Multimedia is an empty array. So this is, one of the challenges of working with large data sets, especially working with APIs, is you have to know if your data is consistent, and if it's not, you have to deal with that. So we're going to use a ternary here. we're going to check, does it have any multimedia? Because we know that array is going to be defined. But if the length is not 0, we're going to grab the first element from that array and then use the URL for the image. That does not exist. If there is no length property, then the image is going to be null. And lastly, I don't know when the article is created. Bao, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. So since your ternary returns a null if there's no image, can you use ampersand like between just two variables?
Yeah, the only difference now is that if random article.multimedia is empty, then the image property will be, wait.
Because I was just curious, like if it's false, like what would be the return value of it? Will be null or it's just false or something else?
Okay, so in this case, if the image has no multimedia, then image will have the value of 0, because multimedia.length would be 0 if it had no images. And so then it doesn't matter what we have here. So I think that does actually like cause the application to function correctly, but it just feels kind of wrong to me. I think if the length of this array is 0, we should set the image property to null or undefined. Null would be better, because that is like more of a deliberate kind of thing that a programmer would set. Whereas using this syntax here, this is going to set image to 0 when multimedia.length is 0. You know, I can demonstrate that really quick. Oh, right. So this is what would have happened in that situation. We're saying image is 0 and some string. So it's going to take the value of 0, which like it doesn't really make sense to me to set this to 0. So I'm going to use the ternary here so I can explicitly set it to null instead. Sound good?
Yep, thank you.
All right, so that's an article. Well, we're setting it in our state. So let's look at our article teaser. See if we can use that data now. So now I could just pass everything in, like ID equals article.id, and you know, title equals title. There's kind of a bunch of properties here. And so instead of passing them in one by one, I'm going to pass them all in at once using the spread syntax. So this is saying that for all these properties that are on this article state value, we're going to pass them in individually as key value pairs. So it's the same thing as, you know, saying ID equals random article index, title equals random article.title, abstract equals random article.abstract, saying all of those as individual props on the article teaser. Instead, I'm just going to pass them all in at once. It's just kind of a more concise syntax. Andrew, question?
So my question is about the use of the spread operator here. When you're passing in the dictionary, don't you already have access to all those materials? Because article is a dictionary, right?
Yeah. Articles dictionary. Should
Couldn't
be
we
back
just,
there.
my question is, couldn't article just be passed through and we already have access to everything without the spread operator?
You mean just like article equals article?
Yeah.
This is definitely not conventional React code, but I don't want to tell you this doesn't work. Let me just see what happens here. I guess that works. This is definitely like not how I usually see people write React code. I think part of the reason is because for these props, people still want to kind of pretend like they're HTML properties. And so for an HTML element, the value of the property has to be a string. So I think, a lot of people kind of prefer this spread syntax because they can pretend like they're just passing in a whole bunch of individual strings. And it's a little bit closer to how HTML elements work naturally. We're using using this syntax, it certainly works. We're just like passing an object into a function, but it's a little bit stranger from the perspective of like HTML properties. You don't usually pass an entire object in as a single HTML property. So maybe if you're used to more conventional like HTML template development, this would seem strange to you. But definitely this, I think, is more conventional React code. This looks like very familiar to me. But yes, that was an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that before, but it seems like it works just as well. All right, so now we're passing the article in to the article teaser. And now here's our article teaser at the top of the page. It's got the title and the created date, not with the super pretty format, but that is the date technically. We're gonna go just one step further. Gonna add a click event to this guy. So just kind of a dummy placeholder passing this anonymous function, and then the article teaser. On the title, we're going to have a click event handler. All right, so now just set up a very basic click handler, kind of preparing us for the next steps where clicking on these titles will actually, navigate the page or do other more interesting things. But we've got some basic setup here. So I think this is a good time to take a break before I build the next two components that we're going to use for this application. Does anybody have any questions so far just about what I've built in this article teaser component? Rob?
Yeah, could you jump back to your article teaser.js? Yeah, right there.
Oh, sorry.
The teaser, yeah. And you passed in props.id. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Other questions? Saw a few hands.
Oh, yeah, can I just ask about the slide that you're on, or the code that you're on right now for the A tag? You put like a for the href. If you just leave it blank, it also seems to work, but is this just convention to put the symbol instead?
It changes the styling. If you don't
Or I'm
have
sorry,
an
like if
href.
you sorry, just like in the href, like actual, like just an empty string instead of like having the symbol there.
So if you have an empty string, it still tries to navigate you. So clicking on that link, it takes you somewhere. I don't know where it takes you with an empty string as the href, but it's clearly refreshing the page. Setting the href to a hash means that this is a link within the current page. This is actually something we'll talk about more on Monday, I believe. We talk about React Router.
Okay, thank you.
Is there another question?
Yes, Rafael. So for the props.create-a-date, I would assume that's passed in from the state value. Create a date.
Create a date is on the article state.
Okay. I'm wondering, because since the way you passed in the state value is as a spread operator, just a string, I was wondering how is it referred on the other side by just calling props.create-date? Like, what if you put in another state value? Would the other end know which state value we're referring to?
So any key value pair that we add in the element as a property, it's available on props. So, all these things here, we're inserting create a date, image, whatever, these would all be available as props.image, props.create-a-date, etc., because we're using the spread syntax here.
So if we put in like another state value, like complete different state value, and we send it through the component, the props will also have access to that different state. Okay.
We have props.foo as bar.
Because on the article, you didn't really give it a name to refer to. So I was just curious, like how that works out.
Yep.
Thank you.
Other questions? There's two hands up. Someone just yell out.
Oh, I'm not sure on line 23, after handle, title, click, that parentheses, are we like passing in like a function? How come we're not just putting like console.log inside of that?
Because we are defining a function to be called later. We're telling the article teaser what its handle, title, click function should be. So we don't want to call this immediately. We want to give it this function so that it can use it. So in the article teaser, it gets that function from its props, and then the article teaser knows to set that as an on-click handler. Cool.
I know, I'm still not getting it actually. I'm still not sure what that parentheses does right after you put the bracket.
I mean, this is an anonymous function, but
okay.
This is just, we're defining a function where we call another function.
Okay, that makes a little more sense. Thank you.
And then one last question before the break. No questions?
Yeah, Raphael, do you mind explaining the spread operator again? Why don't you need an attribute identifier in front of that on 23? Yeah, I think it's on 23 as well.
Because I wanted all of these properties to be inserted as individual props. Like I wanted to have ID equals, whatever, title equals whatever. I wanted these as individual props, not like props.article.id, props.article.title. And so the spread syntax is a simple way for me to get all that in at once.
Thanks.
Yep. All right, so it's 11:20 now. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 11:30, and I'm gonna build out the rest of the components for this application. So first of all, I just want to say that over the break, Ivan has been sharing some great code snippets with all of us, particularly how to adapt your application to use React 18. So if you just use the boilerplate that comes from creat-react-app, it's apparently intended for React version 17. I don't know why creat-react-app is not updated alongside React itself so that the boilerplate generated matches what React is expecting. But here we are. This is the React ecosystem where there's just dozens of different libraries that are intended to work together but are actually independent from each other. So that's fun. But anyway, instead of react-dom.render in my index.js, we're using a react-dom.create-root. This kind of feels like the same thing to me, and I don't understand why I have to bother with this and why the framework doesn't handle it. But at any rate, if you're using React version 18, this is how it asks you to write your code in the index.js. It shouldn't really change too much beyond just this one file. But now I don't get these errors in my console, so that's nice. I love not having errors in my console. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add some navigation to this site. Typically on a news site, there's some like top bar with a list of links. We can actually just go to Hacker News real quick. So first of all, is everyone familiar with Hacker News? You all read this like every day, first thing when you wake up, right? Totally, everybody. Well, if you don't, you should. I would totally recommend it. This is like my #1 source for staying in touch with what the dev community is up to, what people are thinking about. But you might notice that they have this kind of top bar at the very top with some links to different sections of the site. We're going to do something similar using some placeholder data for the moment, but it should achieve the same purpose of letting us prototype our application and just having some nav links that take up space so we can feed them into a component. So let's see here. So just the same way that we imported the news from this news.json, we're going to import these nav items from this nav items.json. And this is a much simpler data structure. Each nav item just has a label and a value. So the value is supposed to be like a string that we can use in our code. And then the label is more like a human readable value. So it's going to have like capital letters and spaces in it. So it's a little bit easier for people to read. So we're going to import the nav items over there. See, then at the top of our page, we're going to have our app nav. That makes sense to put that at the top. I'm going to pass some data in. It's going to take the nav items. So again, not a super interesting event handler, just hard coding something in here to make sure that we're able to handle the event, that we know when it gets clicked on. app nav. Okay, so now those nav items are being passed into the app nav. So let's actually define the app nav so that it uses those. Because right now, if we just refresh the page, oh, actually, we're going to see errors. Maybe I should fix that first. Oh yeah, so this is that issue before about how you have to return exactly one top level element. So I'm dumb here. I put my app nav outside of this div. React doesn't like that. It's inside of the div. Okay, so now it's yelling at me about something else different. So that's good. We're getting new, different, better errors. App nav is not defined. I need to import that. So pretty similarly to how I got the article teaser, app nav components / app nav.js. And of course, this is still an empty component. There's nothing in here yet. So this is probably still going to error. Yeah. Because the component doesn't return anything. So let's actually define this component now. So remember, in the props, we're passing in a list of nav items. You know, they all look kind of like this. It's an array of objects. Those are at props.nav items. Now we want to render one nav item for each item in that array. So I'm going to map over it. All right. So I can't just write JavaScript wherever I want. It's got to be inside of these curly brace tags. So let me add those so my linter doesn't yell at me. So for each nav item, we're going to render a link. That's what your nav bar is. Essentially, it's just a list of links. So for each one of these, there's going to be an anchor. I'm not exactly sure yet where it's supposed to go, so we're just going to put a hashtag in there for the href. For the key, we're just going to use the index of the items in the nav items array. I don't want to think too hard about the key. They just need to be different for each item, so the index is good enough. And then something should happen when we click on these nav items. When I have more pages for my application, I'll actually be able to do something useful. But for here, I'm just going to hard code in some kind of default behavior. Oop. All right, so when we click on this anchor, so when we click on this anchor, it's going to call the handle nav click function that was passed in from the app. So yeah, this function just gets called whenever we click on an individual nav item. Then we need to actually display something. So we're going to use that label value. Remember, I said the label is supposed to be more human readable. So this is what we display to the user, the label, whereas the value is what gets passed around in our code. So let's see, then we end the JSX, or we end the JavaScript. bit, we end the nav. Almost forgot again, we need to export the component itself. So let's see how that looks. Doesn't look like I'm seeing my nav items. What is going on here? Okay, so I do have the nav items.
Are you not using your spread operator? On line 25 for your nav items?
Yeah, I don't think spread is what I wanted here, actually. I did want all the nav items as a whole array. Yeah, that should be right. Look at the app nav again. If I return the JSX, that helps. Let's try that. Yeah, okay, that was the issue. So my map function was computing the value that it needed, but it wasn't actually returning it. The map callback needs to return. So I was just forgetting that keyword there. But also, just as a matter of formatting, I'm going to put this little pipe here just to separate the nav items. Cool. So now we can see these pipes in between the nav items. It kind of looks like a nav bar. We can click on the individual nav items. And at the very least, our application is aware of which one we clicked on. You know, I can see that when I click on the nav items label, the value logs in the console. So it seems like our React application is, you know, aware of what we're clicking on, and it's ready for the next steps where we're going to actually do something interesting and meaningful when we click on these. So we've got our app nav, we've got our article teaser, got everything except for the actual article. Andrew, you got a question?
Yeah, I have a question about your on-click. Why do you set like the handle like nav clicks in the dictionary format? Because if you didn't put it in the dictionary format, it would run automatically, right?
Say that again.
Like your handle nav click, why is it like passed through in a dictionary or object?
Here?
Yeah.
How do you mean? It's just the function by itself is passed in as an individual prop. Like
Could you go to your other one, not like one of the JavaScript files that has it?
Hey,
So-
Andrew, I think, isn't that basically denote the JSX right there, those brackets? Isn't that what that is?
Oh.
It's not a dictionary, it's
Oh, okay, I see it. Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah, it's easy to get
Yeah.
confused because there's only so many punctuation marks on your keyboard, and there's a lot of things that we need to separate from other things. So yeah, these curly braces get used a lot for different things, different circumstances. That's just one of the hard parts about programming, is training your eyes to visually tell these apart. That yeah, the curly braces here, this is JSX. You know, elsewhere it's going to be for like a dictionary, elsewhere it'll be for a function. So that's something, as you as you get more experience with reading lots of code, you'll be able to recognize more quickly like what kind of block these curly braces are enclosing. But for sure, when you're starting out, that's an easy thing to get confused about. Wow.
Thank you. So is it possible to run through how your onClick function works? Like how does it talk to each other on the other end from the app.js? The anonymous functions.
So from the app.js, we are rendering an app nav. And we're giving it this property, handle nav click, which has the value of this function. So, the outer curly braces are just so we can put JavaScript in our HTML. So you can even see that they're different colors. There's this blue curly brace on the outside. Then this white curly brace on the inside, that's just the boundaries of our function. So this is a function that I'm giving to the app nav component. It doesn't have a name because it's just an anonymous function that I'm defining right here in the render function. But this is a function. It takes clicked item in as a parameter, and it will console log whatever it gets in as that parameter. So then in order to figure out what is actually being done with this function, how is it used, we have to look into the app nav component itself, see what does it do with handle nav click. So I'll look at the appnav.js. And we can see that in the app nav, this anchor has an onClick method. So this is an actual event handler saying when we click on this anchor, this function is going to run. And so here we're defining another anonymous function, but all it does is call props.handle nav click. So we're calling one function that calls another function.
Just to make sure, so at here, the nav item.value is exactly same as clicked item on the other side, right? Like the parameter.
Saying nav item.value is the same as
like clicked item, like the argument in the parameter. So
right. That's right. So when we click on a nav item, each of these nav items has a value. They have a label and a value. That's just based on this list of data here. Each of our nav items has a label and a value. So when we click on that nav item, we're passing in the nav item's value into props.handleClick. And so if you want to know what props.handleClick actually is, we have to look at the parent. So app.js is the parent to appnav. And here we can see what's being passed in for handle nav click. It's this anonymous function, which takes in that argument and then just console logs it. So this nav item.value gets passed in as the clicked item here, and then we console log in.
yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Cool, you're welcome. Any other questions? Also, these questions? No, okay. So let's actually make an article component. This is going to be actually very similar to the article teaser. So it's going to take the same data. It's going to take the article, but we're going to just display different data. We're going to display more data on the screen. Put some HRs in here just for visual separation so we can read this a little more easily. Okay, so it's yelling at me because article is not defined, so I need to import that. Article from components article.js. So now it's probably yelling at me because this article component is not actually a component, it doesn't return anything. So let's make it a component so it does return something. So when you're reading an article, generally you expect it to start with the title. That up here. Never mind. Let's try and do something fancy. It didn't work. So instead of an H1, this is going to be paragraph instead of the title. We want to see the created date. So we definitely want to view the byline, but we don't know if it exists. Not all of the news stories have a byline. So if it doesn't, we're not going to create an H2 with empty text, because the H2 is going to have like a ton of margin and padding, even if it's empty. So we want to just not render it at all if there's no byline. And similarly for the image, not all of our news stories are going to have an image. So first we're going to check that they have an image. And if so, I'm going to set the source for the image to the image URL that we got from our data. And then lastly, we'll just put the abstract. Every article has an abstract. Before I forget, export the article. And we're already passing all the data in, just using the spread syntax. All right, so this is our article. It's got a title, it's got a date, it has sometimes a byline and an image, and it has an abstract. It looks like the abstracts here are not even like the real article abstracts, but it's all like lorem ipsum placeholder text. So this isn't even Latin. This is fake Latin, so that if you did know Latin, you wouldn't get distracted by reading like real sentences. So this is not intelligible to anyone. But it does look like our news app is working correctly, because not all of the articles have images. So we are only sometimes seeing an image when we update the page. But yeah, so that's not a news site. That's a few components that we're going to use as part of our news site. But that's as much as I'm going to show you today. So tomorrow, we're going to just pick up where we left off right now, and then use these components in more of an organized news site that's going to have different pages. That's going to let users click on different story titles to view different articles. But we have to set this foundation. We have to create the building blocks that we're going to use for the rest of our application. John, you have a question?
This is kind of just going into the future, but whenever we're doing the full stack portion of everything, Are we gonna handle all the, like the transformation of data on the back end more than on the front end?
That is a good question. And it's a question you're going to have to ask yourself repeatedly over your career as a developer. If you want to give me some more context, I can maybe give you a more specific answer.
Well, I mean, it's just in general, it just seems like it's a way harder to transform everything on the JavaScript side using React versus just when you're working with the CRUDing basically on the back end with Python.
I'd say that there are kind of different philosophies about this. You could do it either way. Some people talk about having thick clients versus thick servers. So your application could have a thick server and a thin client, meaning that you do as much of the computation as possible on the server. And then you just send the clients like the actual values that it needs to show to the user. And then kind of the flip side of that is having a thin server with a thick client where the server is more just storing the raw data and then sending like all the raw data down to the client. And then the client has to kind of parse it and organize it into a form that is intelligible for the user. My preference generally is I try to do as much logic as possible on the server side and try to, predict what the client's needs are going to be, and then like prepare the data as much as possible so the client doesn't have to do any of this logic and can just present it on the screen as is. But sometimes it just doesn't make sense to do that. Sometimes you just have to think practically like about the company you're working with and like who are the backend developers, who are the front end developers, who actually knows what shape the data is supposed to have. So sometimes like the backend developers just have no clue what the data is supposed to look like on the front end. And it's too much of a hassle to tell them exactly how your React app needs it structured because they're not React developers. So maybe you can just tell them like, just get it out of the Postgres database, convert it into some sensible looking JSON objects and send to the front end, and then we'll figure it out from there. So it's a lot of logistics. It depends on the business needs. Hard to give you a hard and fast rule, but all things being equal, I would prefer to do things on the back end if there are not other constraints. Possibly more of an answer than you asked for, but I hope that helps.
It did, thank you.
Cool. People have any other questions about this part of an application that I've started today?
I've got a question. I'm still like not understanding. So in the appnav.js file on line 7, I believe you're calling an anonymous function that points to a function that's passing in the props. So why wouldn't we just pass in the props function as, just right there without it being anonymous?
So you're saying instead of this, you're talking about this?
Yeah.
So if we just pass the function in like this, this is not actually passing a function reference to the onClick because I'm just calling the function here. So I'm just calling props.handle navclick with this particular value. And then this is going to return some value. And then that's what we're passing in for the onClick here. So I know that props.handle navclick does not return a function. So this would not be appropriate to pass in here. So I need to put a function in here, not just some value that is returned from a function. So potentially what I could do is just this. Here I'm just passing in the function itself. But in this case, when the function gets called, it's going to get called with the event object as the first parameter. But I wanted to be called with navitem.value as its first parameter. So if I'm declaring an event handler, but I don't want the first parameter to actually be the event object, I have to declare an anonymous function here. So like the event object is being passed in here because this is an event handler, when this function gets called, my browser is going to call it like this with the event object passed in. But in this case, I don't care about the event object. I want the first argument to be this nav item value. So I'm defining my own anonymous function, which, yeah, technically takes the event object. I don't really care about that. I could define it or not. What's important is that using this syntax, I get to choose what argument is passed into my function. So I specifically want this to be called with nav item.value.
That cleared it up. Thank you.
Cool. Wow.
Sorry, do you mind go back to the app.js real quick? I just want to see the handle nav click function.
Yeah, handle nav click.
So will it be possible like to put that function, like create that function in the other file and just call that function from that file directly instead of calling from app.js?
Saying,
because all we pass in is just the state value, and we can just use that state value on the other end and use the function that's created on the appnav.js and call it from here. Will that still be possible?
so this should work the same way. What is going on here? JS unexpected token 27. Okay, so yeah, I just refactored the application slightly, so it does work the same way. Now we have the same behavior. I'm no longer handling the click in the app.js. I'm now handling the click event in the app nav. So just as a matter of like code flow, this does work, but it's a question of separation of responsibilities. It's a question of who is responsible for what, who is responsible for knowing about what. That is the app component supposed to know what happens when we click on the app nav? Or does the app just know that it's clickable? Or is the app nav supposed to know what happens when it gets clicked on? So the way we've got it set up currently, from the app, we have no idea what happens when we click on the app nav component. That's not a detail that we're thinking about at this level, but it's only like a detail for the app nav itself. And then when we look at the app nav, we can see, oh, it's got this click handler. So the app nav needs to be responsible for what happens when it is clicked on. So the way that we had this organized before, is that the app component is responsible for what happens when the app nav gets clicked on. So this makes the app nav like kind of more of a generic component. Maybe we could put this app nav on different pages and have it behave slightly differently, but look the same way. So because this is such a small application, it's kind of hard to say that one way or the other is correct or incorrect, but it's just a matter of how do you want to reuse these components and which component is responsible for knowing what the other components should be doing.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Cool. All right, what other questions do we have? Questions, going once, going twice. Andrew.
Could you push your code up? Could you push the code up
I can. Yeah, I can definitely do that. There's already like another version of this app being pushed up to the demos folder, so it's going to maybe be a little bit weird. I'm going to probably have one repo that's like the full project from start to finish, and then there might be also separate repos for each day's code. So I'm going to push this code as React News Site 1. You might also see React News Site without any numbers. So try not to get confused, but yeah, I'm definitely going to push this. Any other questions? So let's see, we do have a little bit of homework for tonight. Primarily news site 1, you're going to build a news site that is similar to the one that I showed you today. So I hope you weren't following along with the lecture, because if you were, then you just already completed the homework for tonight, and what fun is that? But in addition to that, there's a Mad Libs exercise for tonight. So you're going to have to complete a Mad Libs game, basically, where users can type in a few random words, and then the application tells you a story using those words. That should be very silly, because you didn't know what the story was when you had to choose the words to insert into it. This challenge is actually kind of interesting in that you can complete this challenge by writing relatively little code, honestly. But what makes this hard is that there's so much starting code to begin with. So the hard part is just reading the existing code, seeing what the application already is doing, and then figuring out what little you need to add on to it to satisfy the requirements. So I really like this exercise. This is more challenging to read code than write it, which practically speaking, professionally, is probably the harder part of working with React applications, is getting onboarded and figuring out like what the heck are these other people trying to do here. Whereas like writing your own project from scratch is a little bit easier once you get into like patterns that you find comfortable. So yeah, this is going to challenge you to read someone else's code. Yeah, so that's today, that's tonight. Any questions about what's going on for the rest of the day, the rest of the week? Just React news, any questions at all?
Yeah, are we doing that Beyond Tech today? Do you know?
It is on the calendar, and I have not heard from John recently, so I assume it's on. Let me double check that and confirm with you though. But yeah, you should expect to be on tech at 4:30 p.m. today. Any other questions? Okay, it looks like we're either satisfied or overwhelmed. So I think this is a good time to stop the day's lecture.